Today we're going to speak about the kings of Israel, and we're going to begin with King Saul, who actually was the first king of Israel before King David. King Saul was a figure who started out from very humble beginnings. He was a donkey driver, and the people had come to the prophet Samuel saying, "We want a king, like all the other countries have," which he rebuked them for. And God sent him a message, a prophecy, that he should find Saul, anoint him as the first king of Israel. Now, Saul fit the part in certain ways. He was head and shoulders above everyone else. He turned out to be a great warrior and a brilliant general. However, at the same time, as we said, he was from very humble beginnings and was very reluctant to take the position. The message was that the king can come from very simple background, doesn't have to be an aristocrat. And as his life and his rulership unfolded, Saul turned out to be a very tragic figure because there were weaknesses in his leadership. Because of that, Samuel would demote him, would tell him that his line would not continue as the king. And he met a tragic death in battle, falling on his own sword to prevent himself from being captured and perhaps being tortured. Before we move on to talk about King David, let's step back and talk about kingship in Israel. Now, let's be honest. If we think about the idea of a king, it's somewhat foreign to our modern sensibilities. You do have kings today, King of England, lots of pomp and circumstance, but no power, as we know. So, what was the role of a king? Why would the Torah designate that kings should be appointed? And we'll have to see in which way it does. So in the Torah itself, we have the book of Deuteronomy, which tells us that after the Jews enter the land, and they come and they ask for it, and they say, "Give us a king like all the other nations," it says, then they should set a king upon themselves. Now, once again, this idea of having a king like all the other nations. And certainly Samuel viewed it very negatively. It was the wrong motivation. So what is the right motivation? The king was anointed by the prophet, and so, in a sense, he was divinely appointed. And we'll see the ideal in King David of the king not just as a political and military leader, but as a spiritual leader. But in the Torah itself, it tells us that the king has certain limitations, because as we know, it's very easy to abuse power. He should not have too much money. He should not have too many horses. And yes, it says he should not have too many wives. He should not have a harem, like many of the kings did back then. He also, and this shows the spiritual dimension, had to have a Torah with him all the time. Meaning on his person, according to some commentaries, it was actually tied onto his arm. And the message is that he was to rule his kingdom according to the values of the Torah. Which brings in, once again, that he is a spiritual figure as well. And so while there are two types of kingship, there's benevolent kingship and there's rulership by fiat. The Jewish king obviously ideally was the former and not the latter. He also had to consult with the prophet or with the high court to run an offensive war. And we're going to see that, in fact, there were a whole system of, yes, checks and balances with three branches of government. In a sense, the executive was the king. The high court and the legislative body were one and the same, the elders or the Sanhedrin. And then the third branch was the prophet or the high priest. Now, as we come back to our discussion of King Saul and King David, what's striking about King Saul is that he came from the tribe of Benjamin. It calls him Ish Yimini. And in the book of Genesis, we see that it tells us the scepter will not depart from Judah and the staff between his feet. So Jacob told his son Yehudah that his descendants would be the kingship. And in fact, it continues to say in Genesis, until Od Shiavos Shiloh, until the one that is his has come. Who is the one that is his? That is a reference to the idea of the Messiah. That the Messiah will be a king ruler and will also be a descendant of Yehudah. So we come to King David, who was the descendant of Judah. And we're confronted with this question of where does Saul fit in? Now, David, we know David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam. David, he lives and he is established forever. King Saul's line was cut off. And perhaps we could suggest that when the Jews asked for a king like all the other nations, in a sense, the prophet said, okay, that's what you will get. You'll get a tall, head over shoulders king like Saul, who maybe was 6'2" in a time where most people were 5'5". He'll be a general, he'll be a great warrior, but he did not fulfill his role in all the ways he needed to, and his line ended. David represents what in the Torah would be the mitzvah to appoint a king. Now, who is David? Perhaps the most famous story of King David is the story of David and Goliath. It's ironic that in 1967, the state of Israel being attacked by 5 Arab armies was viewed as the David against the Goliath. And that narrative has been flipped around, unfortunately. David was the youngest son of Jesse from Bethlehem, and he was sent to his brothers who were fighting at the front lines. The battle was against the Philistines, who were living in what is today Gaza, interestingly enough. And they were camped in a stand down. The Israelites on one side of the mountain, the Philistines on the other. And here we have the map of the Valley of Elah, which actually is 10 minutes away from where we live, right down the road. And on the upper right, you see the edge of Ramat Beit Shemesh, where we live. And it's amazing to live just down the street from 3,000 years of Jewish history. So David arrives to bring his brothers food, who are at the front lines. Sound familiar? He's making a barbecue for his brothers, who are militia fighters who are called up, and sees this stand down. And every day, the mighty Goliath would march out. And if Saul was 6'2", Goliath must have been like 7 feet, like these towering basketball players, with enormous armor, a big sword, and even Saul could not take him on. And so David asked about him, and he goes to the king. He goes to Saul and says, I will take him on. And he says, who are you? And he says, I'm a shepherd. I fight off lions and bears, which did used to exist in the land of Israel, and I will fight him. Saul offers him his armor, which David declines, and David goes out with his slingshot, with a few stones, hits Goliath right between the eyes, and he comes toppling down. And David is also given the king's daughter to marry. Now, he wasn't yet a known person. And as Saul's kingship starts to falter, Samuel secretly comes and anoints David king. He comes to the city of Bethlehem. He finds the family of Jesse, and he says, where are your sons? And he lines up his 6 sons. David is not there. He was the outcast. He was the runt of the family. He was sent off to be with the sheep. And as Samuel looks at each one, he says, no, and no, and no. And he gets to the 6th, and he says, no, it's not you either. And we understand that the prophet had a divine insight to see who would be king. And he says, are there any other sons? And they say, you don't want to see him. And he says, yes, I do. And David is brought before him. He lifts up the horn of oil, poured on David's head, which is the process how the kings were anointed and not crowned. They were anointed in humility with oil, which was used in the temple to anoint holy vessels, meaning he was being dedicated as God's representative to lead the people, not with a crown of power, once again, to lord over the people. So, and that's how David secretly became king. Now, when we look at King David, we see a very unique personality. He wrote the book of Psalms, which comprises the majority of our prayer book. And in the Psalms, we see his emotional highs, his lows. He pours out his heart to God. And today, the Psalms are our vehicle to connect to the Almighty as well. So he was a great religious personality. And the Torah tells us, in addition to that, perhaps most importantly, he acted and ruled justly with the people. He was from the tribe of Judah, which is key, as we mentioned. He established Jerusalem as the capital of his ancient Israel. But paradoxically, he was never allowed to build the temple because God tells him, you have too much blood on your hands. David also had a very aggressive, almost violent side to his personality as well. And for a while, he was a mercenary when he fled Saul and lived outside of Israel for 7 years. But he channeled his violent nature to fight God's wars. And he channeled his emotions into the Psalms and into his relationship to God. King David, notably, as we mentioned, his descendant will be the Messiah. And he also became a great general and warrior. Now, what's special about King David? He did live a very difficult life. His son rebelled against him and almost overthrew his kingship. When he was stopped and then against David's wishes was killed, so he lost his son Avshalom. Shimi ben Bichri rebelled against him. And we know he also made grave mistakes. He said to God, test me. And God placed that night in front of him as he walked out on his balcony, Bathsheba, whose beauty struck him so much that he summoned her and he fell in love with her. She was married at the time, but she was married to Uriah, a soldier. And the practice at the time was for the soldiers to issue a divorce document to their wives before they went out to war that would be valid retroactively if they should die in war. And so, legally, technically, David did not commit adultery because Uriah he sent out to the front lines. He was killed. Retroactively, she was no longer his wife. But the prophet Nathan comes to him and tells him he's done a wrong deed. He's done a terrible act. And David's reaction is recognition, acceptance, and repentance, to admit he was wrong. And that quality is also noteworthy, noted that part of David's greatness is not that he didn't make mistakes. He was a very human figure, as many of the great leaders that we've already talked about. But he was able to say he was wrong and able to repent. And in the Psalms, he says he kept this sin in front of him the rest of his life, being aware of his weaknesses. So this is the tumultuous life of King David, the musician of Israel. You see him here depicted with his harp. David also was a profoundly religious personality. And here we see that when the ark was brought to Jerusalem, he danced in front of it. He was married, as we mentioned, to Saul's daughter, who she came from kingship, even though David did not. And she looked out of the window, saw David, and she despised him for dancing like that. But he didn't care because he was doing it to show his joy over the establishment of Jerusalem. Now, the capital being destined to be in Jerusalem. In the Torah, God says, when you enter the land, you will go to the land place that I will show you. And that place, David understood, was the place where Jacob had his dream, where Jacob's ladder occurred. And the dream of the ladder was connected to the gate of heaven. So our understanding is that Jerusalem is a spiritual portal. It's a place of inherent spiritual intensity, and that David understood was destined to become the capital, the center of focus of Israel's not just political life, but spiritual and religious life as well. So he established the city of David, which is below what is today the Temple Mount. We see that the Temple Mount, the temple was not there in David's time. So everything from the wall down, and today if you go to the old city, you go to the Kotel, you exit the gate, turn left, and it's down on the right. And what we're going to show is that today we have incredible archaeological finds which are coming out from this location from 3,000 years ago. The Kotel, if you want to situate yourself, is on the upper left side of the Temple Mount. And the city of David was built upon a ridge. And that's why in the Psalms it says, who will go up to the house of the Lord? Because you had to walk uphill to get to the temple. The city was below it, even though Mount Moriah, where it was built, was encircled by higher mountains, like the Mount of Olives and Mount Scopus. But that was destined to be the center of worship. And so it tells us in the book of Samuel, David captured the stronghold of Zion. It's now the city of David. And after he did so, the prophet came to him and said, set up an altar to God on the threshing floor of Arumah the Jebusite. He was not Jewish, although he lived in Israel. The Jebusites had been conquered, but those non-Jews who agreed to live in peace, who abided by the 7 Noahide universal moral code, had a place in society in Israel, like we have minorities today in Israel as well. And Arumah said to him, whatever you want, sire, I will give you this field for no cost. David insisted on buying it, and that brought the ark there, but it would not yet be the location of the temple. It was still temporary. David's career grew, his rulership grew, his repute grew, and he expanded the kingdom of Israel to include the neighboring kingdoms, as we see on the map, of Edom, Moab, Ammon, and Aram. And so it extended from the Negev desert all the way through Syria, across to Jordan, and north into Lebanon. Now, you would ask, How could it be? Why would that be the right thing to go take other people's land? So we talked last week about how for hundreds of years, the Jewish people were harangued by neighboring kingdoms that would attack them. They would have to gather an army. And the reality in the Middle East, in the ancient Middle East, and I was going to say in the Middle East, things have not changed so much, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's now India and Pakistan, is that unfortunately, too often, the neighboring kingdoms, if you are not more powerful than them, which in the ancient world meant dominating and conquering them, then they will attack you. And so David's conquering these lands actually brought a period of peace which lasted through the kingdom of his son, King Solomon. We're now going to turn to look at the chronology. And last week, we looked at the patriarchal age and the age of the judges. So you can see here from our timeline, going from about 1900 BCE to the year 1020 BCE. And the first temple will be built around the year 1000. And the next 500 years, which we'll be looking at, will be called the First Temple period. Now, we also see parallel the books from the Bible, the books from the Torah, the Old Testament, which we call the Tanakh, Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, the prophets, and Ketubim, the writings. The time of King David is written, the story of King David is written down in the book of Samuel and in the book of Kings. Now you have 2 historical books in the Torah, the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, and our tracing the history of the kings of Israel will go through this period and look at these books as one of the sources. Parallel, you have various prophets who arose, and we'll talk about some of them as well as we continue on through the next installment of the second part of our history crash course. And the second installment will be the historical evidence, the archaeological basis to validate and understand the kingdom of David and the Jewish kings after them.